Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I'm Florence Eshalomi. I'm the chair of the committee. I'm going to ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, please. Chris.
I'm Chris Curtis, MP for Milton, Keynes North. Councillor Marland is leader of my council.
Sarah Smith, the Member of Parliament for Hyndburn.
Joe Powell, Kensington and Bayswater.
Will Forster, MP for Woking. A declaration is I'm still a serving Woking Borough Council councillor, which is receiving EFS and government intervention if that comes up.
Lee Dillon, the MP for Newbury, and since our last public meeting of this committee, I've stood down from my roles as a councillor on Thatcham Town Council and West Berkshire Unitary.
Lewis Cocking, MP for Vauxhall, and I'm still a Hertfordshire County Councillor.
Agamahinja, Conservative Member of Parliament for South West Hertfordshire.
Thank you very much. Can I ask our guests to introduce themselves, please?
Councillor Bill Revans. I'm the leader of Somerset Council.
I'm Councillor Pete Marland. I'm the leader of Milton Keynes City Council. I'm also chair of the LJ Resources Board and a Declaration of Interest. Obviously, Chris is my MP, and I also occasionally advise him on matters of housing and planning.
I'm Jeremy Newmark. I'm the leader of Hertsmere Borough Council in Hertfordshire, and I'm the finance and investment spokesperson for the District Councils Network.
Councillor Lewis, please.
I'm Councillor Barry Lewis, leader of Derbyshire County Council and finance spokesperson for County Council Network.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming before the committee this morning. This is our second session looking at the sustainability of local government finance, and I think it's fair to say local government finance continues to be in the news. It's a key feature for all of us as parliamentarians. I just wanted to ask with a question to our witnesses around, in this day and age where obviously a number of you have set your council budgets, do you think that local authorities have been asked to deliver too much with very little resources? Councillor Raven.
Yes, it's the very short answer. In particular, around adult social care, children's social care, SEND, housing and homelessness, we're seeing increasing pressures on those services, and we've obviously seen a reduction in the funding to local government over a good number of years. Figures vary, but I'm told around 40% of our funding from central government has gone. So we've almost walked into a situation where council tax is funding social care. And if you remember, council tax was brought in 1991 as a temporary measure almost, when the poll tax or community charge, depending on how we want to look at it, when that was ended. And so we're funding social care out of a tax on 1991 property values. No one would actually come to that conclusion as being a way forwards. So, and 66%, I think it is this year, of our budget goes on social care. So it's increasingly, and I know of councils that are now talking about figures projecting to the 70s and 80%. If we are going to fund social care out of something, council tax is the wrong way of doing it, and that would be my main message to you.
Councillor Marland.
Well, it depends on the focus of the question. So if you're saying the council's been asked to do too much, I would say no, because councils, by their very nature, are leaders of place. Should we be delivering housing? Yes. Should we be keeping children safe? Yes. Should we be making sure that children with special educational needs have the right education to make sure that they can get on in life? Yes. I think the issue tends to be where those resources are, how councils can't move resources around within the system. I think the LJ would say there is an £8 billion gap in the funding over the next 3 years, but I would also make the case that a lot of the service pressures that are pushed onto local government are through central government requirements. So SEND hasn't been reformed in many, many years. The adult social care system hasn't been reformed in many, many years. So the answer to your question is it's more nuanced, I think. I don't think councils have been asked to do too much. I think councils should do more, but they need the resources to be able to do it. They need the resources to be able to shape their places, to be able to make sure that we're working to the government's agenda to deliver those good jobs, to deliver those 1.5 million houses. It's just, I think the resources are probably in the system somewhere. They're just not being allocated to the front line of local authorities.
So just on that, Councillor Marland, then you look at the fact that across England, councils are responsible for over 800 services, majority of them mandatory. One of the evidence that we had from Charwell District Council said that they want to see an increase in ongoing funding but a reduction in statutory level of services. Would you agree with that?
I think there is a argument to be made about having a proper co-production discussion around what is statutory and what is not statutory. I think there is a very good argument that a number of the statutory services, sort of what is statutory. So I have a discussion all the time, as no doubt many of you did when you were councillors, as what is statutory. You know, having a library service is statutory, but is that one library in the centre of town with one book in it and no funding to have new books, or is that a different type of service delivered by communities, delivered by parish councils, delivered by other services? So I would say it's less about what is statutory and more about there is a sort of, again, a nuanced argument around ring fencing and what is ring fencing. So, for instance, public health is statutory, but it's also ring fenced. So the public health grant that I get can only be spent on public health, which is no real measure of outcomes. So we've still got a situation where we've got an increase in number of children who are obese. We've got an increase in number of older people who aren't getting their proper flu jabs and COVID jabs, but we can't shift resource into, say, libraries to make sure that where older people are, they get those right injections, they get the right services, because one is statutory and the other is not necessarily statutory, but they don't overlap with each other. So I think it's a more nuanced argument than what is statutory and what is not statutory.
Councillor Newmark.
I think that no one would dispute the fact that council finances are under a level of pressure that is unprecedented, not just in recent history, but ever before. The system's clearly been creaking for a number of years. But I do think that it is an oversimplification to sort of attribute that purely as a function of workload. I think councillors tend to be quite aspirational when it comes to leading their places, and I don't think you hear many of them complaining about workload, but I do think, as I say, it's an oversimplification. I think that what we're really dealing with here, to put it very bluntly, is a local government finance system that is structurally unfit for purpose. As sort of colleagues said, even the most basic things like being able to move money around into different parts of the system and targeted at areas where it's most needed are really difficult to do under the sort of current system. Obviously, the scenario of local government reorganisation adds to the uncertainty, and uncertainty in and of itself creates additional pressures within our own membership base of the district councils. We're finding the eye-watering increase in the need for temporary accommodation. Over the last 12 months, our members were responsible for 91,000 homeless households, and that number is sort of only increasing. And again, it creates another piece of unsustainable pressure when it comes to providing the temporary accommodation or the broader range of homelessness services.
Councillor Lewis, anything to add?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think it's more a case of too much with too little. That is the issue at the minute. And demand continues to rise all the time, which means that the statutory provision that we all provide as local authorities is what we increasingly have to focus our efforts on. The discretionary stuff is much more, it's increasingly becoming more for the birds at the minute, which is unfortunate. We've had to be inventive, as you already heard, around how we provide services as well, particularly preventative services, because we need to reduce that demand arriving at our front door. By 2030, adult social care spending in England is predicted to increase by £11.8 billion, and children's services by £8.4 billion, and home to school transport by £1.7 billion. And these are the sort of the key drivers And together they're going to account for 83% of the total increase of costs that councils are projected to be spending on services by 2030. So there has to be this sort of focus on those key services. So I would say, yeah, and I'll go back to my original point. It's too much with too little at this point.
Just on that, Councillor Lewis, you talked about being inventive with how you deliver some of these services. So a recent LGIU, Local Government Information Unit, State of Finances in England, reported that 52% of respondents identified adult social care as the greatest long-term pressures, and 38% said children's social services, key areas that you've just outlined. Do you think that councils need to keep looking at different ways to manage those services, or what needs to change to address those demands?
We're always looking at different ways of trying to manage those services and try and reduce the demand and so on. But when you have to focus on sort of meeting the demand that you have within the system, you necessarily then have to start thinking about, well, where do you start reducing? And then you start looking at your early help, which almost cuts your own nose off to spite your face in the way that you deliver those sorts of services. So it becomes sort of the key imperative then you need to look at the system, and the system, particularly in children's services, is around high cost placements and how we get the costs for those down. As you'll know, you've probably got those figures at your fingertips, but some of our care placements can cost us in excess of £1 million a year. Some of them for an individual child, some of them heading towards £2 million a year. That is unsustainable. That market is broken. So that's something that we can't address on our own. We need the help of government in that space in particular.
Yeah. And just on that, to both you and Councillor Revans, in terms of children's social care and the transport element, especially in rural areas, do you think that means testing that service would be an area to look at how you alleviate some of the cost pressures?
That could be something that we have to do, but we are. I think each local authority area is looking at that particular issue in its own way and about how they can tackle that particular issue going forward.
Yeah, that would be an option that we could look at, but also one of the significant factors is around inclusion in mainstream schools as well, and we're trying to work with our education sector to improve the inclusion offer, and it's become much more difficult now. The education system is more fractured with academy chains and multi-academy trusts and so on. However, we've managed to bring together our schools in Somerset. We're just investing in 15 in-school SEND units, for example, which should reduce that pressure as well. So yes to the means testing, but there are lots of other things we can do.
Lots of other things. Obviously, you had the discontinuation of the Rural Services Delivery Grant. Do you think that the funding that government are currently allocating to urban and rural areas are fair?
I was very disappointed to see the cancellation of that grant. It stands to reason that providing services in remote areas, and we do have some remote areas at Somerset as well as some urban areas, it does cost more. When it's a mile between houses or 2 miles, it costs more to collect the bins. It's a fairly straightforward equation, and I think the funding formula should recognise that.
Councillor Lewis, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would agree with that, absolutely. I mean, there was a £600 million pound recovery grant, which was great, but it was heavily skewed toward urban areas, ignoring that the social care demand, not just deprivation, is driving financial stresses within the system. And that abolition of the Rural Services Delivery Grant, it took a lot of funding out of councils that really needed that. Counties like Derbyshire, for example, which we have a very significant rural area, the cost of delivering services in those rural areas is much higher than it is in urban areas.
Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just before we move on to some questions around preventative services, I just wanted to understand the views of the panel on the decision to discontinue the safety valve agreements with regards to the high needs block. With the current...
The Project Safety Valve was a very specific project that was focused on a number of councils, for those councils to invest in reducing their send overspend on their high needs block. There is another project which was ongoing, and the government allocated a further amount of money. So while Project Safety Valve has been discontinued, the general principles of Project Safety Valve, which is investing in capital to reduce some spending, has continued. So it's the discontinuation of a very specific name for something. There is a little bit of confusion, and we've had this, I think, and I've had to explain it to a few of councillors, is that the statutory override, which is the government's ability to be able to effectively discount the debt, that's continuing until 2026. If that doesn't continue, that is a very, very big problem. But in terms of Project Safety Valve, that investment in SEND is continuing, and the government have actually put more money in over the past 6 months. I think it was about £500 million.
Yeah, the statutory override is making a big difference. If I think we're projecting will be 64 million overspent there by the end of the financial year, if that is taken into account. And I know that's the case. Many other councils will be looking at 114 notices being issued like confetti.
Councillor Lewis, anything else to add on that, or you?
I mean, the numbers that we've got here are quite stark around this one. If statutory override expires, then a total of 26 out of 38 county and rural unitary authorities would be at risk of issuing a Section 114 notice before 2027. That would include 18 authorities who would be insolvent literally overnight in March 2026 if that happened.
I think there was some evidence, and you may want to look at this as a committee, those Project Safety Valve councils have not necessarily reduced the SEND deficit by particularly a quantum enough to get back into balance, and that is a real problem, because if you actually talk about SEND, it's less about the ability to continue to overspend and more about actually the problems inherent in the SEND system, and I think statutory overrides are great, but it doesn't tackle the underlying problem.
Thanks. So moving a little bit on to the importance of preventative services, have your councils had to make cuts to discretionary preventative services, and what long-term impacts has this caused?
Look, at district council level, we're particularly big on the value of preventative services. They deliver incredible bang for the buck, and my view is that when you start to have to cut those preventative services, it's almost like knocking down the first domino in the line. The area in which we're seeing sort of, if you like, the sort of first wave of cuts to these services is primarily around leisure provision. It is an expensive area to deliver on, but equally I think we've learnt, particularly since the pandemic, that this stuff really matters. At district level, we're rooted particularly close to local communities, and we're able to act in a particularly nimble and agile way when it comes to things like social prescribing, which sort of people have just started getting into operational mode with, and again that's something that we see slowing down. Food and fuel poverty alleviation schemes, there was this sort of rush to sort of bring these on stream a year or so ago. Again, it's something that's slowing down. And I think just a case study that I've mentioned a few times recently over in South Norfolk, where the district council launched a particularly innovative service to expedite hospital discharges. I think in just 2 of their local hospitals, they're estimated to have saved something like 13,000 bed days, saving the NHS over £8.5 million. And it's all of those things that, even if they're not being cut yet, they're being cut back, they're being delivered at a slower pace, and they're under sort of serious threat.
Thank you. Does anyone else from the panel wish to?
Yeah, I'd quite happily add, yes, we've had to look at innovative ways in which we can secure a lot of those preventative services for our communities. That's working with the voluntary sector and the faith sector. It's also around working with the city, town and parish councils that we have for them to take on the funding of services that we would see as preventative. And it's that partnership approach with our colleagues in those sectors which has enabled us to keep some of those services which our communities most value going. However, it is increasingly difficult to justify. Basically, we are moving costs to a different part of council tax in order to keep those services going, which is ultimately, a sign of a broken model for me.
And I assume also dependent on philanthropic funding through the voluntary sector, which is dependent on the wealth of an area, potentially how much.
And we're an area of considerable social inequality. The matrices, so we say, work in a way that make that philanthropy work particularly well for the Somerset Community Foundation. However, that's not an ideal situation for what should be publicly funded services, in my view.
All councils, I'm speaking on behalf of the LGA, and I think you're hearing from the leader of Nottingham next, who sort of, have had to make some very, very, very difficult decisions recently. From a local perspective, we haven't necessarily cut preventative services. We've either changed the model that we deliver them, or we've focused them more. But there is always going to be a place for preventative services, but I would just caution against the headlong charge into that preventative services are a completely different model, which is a panacea that will save a whole load of money for everybody. So a great example of that is actually Milton Keynes Council's split on our adult social care bill. Actually, our adult social care bill is split round about 58%, 42% on 18 to 60-year-olds who have got severe learning disabilities or disabilities. You can't prevent those, and that is a bigger chunk of spending than people who are over 65 and getting older. Now, obviously, that will slightly grow, and that's where there is probably the biggest argument to reduce some funding, although it will be cost mitigation. It won't be sort of stopping all increases, it will just be mitigating that increase. But you cannot prevent a 22-year-old child having severe learning disabilities and severe disabilities and needing day in, day out care. And so I think there is a little bit of preventative is the future. It's absolutely got to be part of the mix, but I would just caution against the idea that a whole load of extra money into preventative services will ultimately sort of be a magic button that we can press. And a good example of that is actually Milton Keynes, where we spent a lot of money on preventative services in our children's department, and this year we had a £10 million overspend because for 12 years we prevented some certain children coming into care. And actually, our evidence base is that we should have taken those children into care when they were 2 or 3, because now they are 14 and 15. We've spent a lot of money, but we're still having to take them into care, and taking a child into care at 15 is a hell of a lot more expensive than taking a child into care at 2 or 3 and having to foster and adopt them. So it's about targeting, and it's about making sure there's an evidential basis for preventative services, as opposed to just saying, well, keeping a leisure centre is open because obviously everybody will go to the leisure centre and they won't be as obese. It's not that easy.
Thank you. And would expansion of government support like the Children's Social Care Prevention Grant help to address increasing demand for services in the longer term?
I don't agree with ring fencing. I think it would be to sort of come and say ring fencing is bad, and then the government to say, oh, we've got another block of money over here, sort of just spend it on this. I think we need an outcomes-based system, that if the government want to grant us money, then it should be outcomes-based, and we should be able to sort of be judged on what we are doing as opposed to a certain block of money in a certain place.
Anyone else wish to come in on that question before we move on?
Just on ring fencing, I mean, I think we're assuming that there may be some announcements from the government on extra ring fencing on planning and planners with relation to potentially increasing planning fees. Would you include that under the list of things that you don't think should be ring fenced?
I think that is a slightly different question, Chris. Because obviously I think, like all services, that planning is a sold service, can wash its face. It's a bit like licensing and things like that, in that I wouldn't go as far as to say we should charge beneficial fees for planning, because obviously what you'd effectively be doing is saying to Barrett's or Taylor Wimpey, sort of like, you know, you pay £1 million for this, and I think it would have a negative consequence on maybe some other areas, like trying to build 1.5 million homes.
So if you don't believe in ring fencing, Councillor Marland, would you say that councils should be mandated to provide statutory services?
Yes.
Which are ring fenced?
Possibly. I think outcomes can be mandated. I wouldn't necessarily say spending can be mandated. So again, I will give you an example from Milton Keynes. We took the radical step of putting up parking to 80 pence an hour in the 5th biggest shopping centre in the country. We cannot increase parking charges any further because on-street parking is ring-fenced, and you can only spend the ring-fenced transport account on legal ring-fenced transport stuff, and that's the sort of area. 80 pence in the 5th biggest city centre shopping area in the country is bonkers, but we've reached the statutory limit of which we can spend it on.
That's all right.
To be very clear, I don't think anyone would ever say no in local government to extra funding. And what we would prefer is the flexibility as to how we spend that money. But it's important that we understand it's the quantum. Yes, we know that government will have its objectives and will want to target resources towards government objectives. We're also democratically elected, and we also have local objectives we want to achieve. And at the moment, when the discretionary services that we have are being squeezed more and more, there is less and less we can do to deliver our objectives, which we were elected to achieve.
Lewis.
Yes. You're essentially saying you don't mind it being ring fenced as long as it suits you. If it doesn't suit you, you don't want it to be ring fenced.
Yeah, I'm a council leader and a politician. There are some good examples of where it can work, and there's some good examples of where it can't work. So another great example, I think Jeremy pointed it out, about the number of councils that are currently having huge problems with temporary accommodation, and this year that the housing prevention grant is ring fenced, 51%, 49%, and 49% has to be spent on housing, on homelessness prevention. Quite who sat in a room and decided it must be 51, 49, I don't know.
Well, we've been asking the Secretary that very question.
So that is a very clear example of where London councils or other councils should be able to apportion that, and actually saying you need to spend money on homelessness prevention, but what is homelessness prevention, and actually you show us that the money that central government gives local councils is value for money.
I think just to come in briefly,
yeah.
I think the sort of underlying philosophical point here, in a world in which devolution seems to be the watchword, is, you know, to what extent does that devolution apply in a fiscal sense as well? To what extent, I mean, yes, mandate outcomes, or at least within parameters, but if the watchword is about creating that level of local autonomy, then it doesn't make sense to say that it would almost apply in every other dimension which a council operates, other than actually managing its own finances in that sense.
Move on to council tax, just mindful of time, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Before I move on to council tax, just a question about independent schools. We've spoken this morning about SEND. There is an argument that independent schools have subsidised SEND provision because affluent families have sent their kids to independent schools instead of sending them to the state sector. Have you done any modelling to see how that's affected your individual council budgets? And if so, is there anything you wish to share with this committee?
We've looked at it, and we've not noticed a discernible increase since VAT. I think many of the private schools were planning with their parents around that area to try and achieve some sustainability. But we will wait with interest to see what the impact will be, and we remain cautious.
Okay, thank you for that. Going to council tax, Councillor Revans, you spoke about the council banding being outdated. Should the ratios of council tax bands be changed and new bands added, either nationwide or by individual councils?
For me, undoubtedly, that's one easy fix that could be made, is to put on additional bands above the current top band as well. At the moment, it works in a quite iniquitous way. The way council tax doesn't have any bearing on ability to pay, and we look at council tax rates all over the country, and you can see some quite bizarre quirks of the system, depending on historic factors, depending on property values in 1991 and what's happened to the market since then. So we see council taxes in incredibly affluent areas of the country being only about double what it is for a band A in the centre of Bridgewater, and I find that inequity to be unhelpful.
Councils have the ability to increase council tax subject to a referendum. The government had multiple councils apply for, but only 6 were accepted. What impact will that have on the council's abilities to set a balanced budget? And
well, I was one of the councils, so do you want me to take that first? We applied and were allowed to go 2.5% over the cap, as I think they call bespoke referendum principles, which is a bizarre way to express it. It still puts our council tax rate below our statistical neighbours. So if you cross the border into Dorset, you'll be paying more council tax for an equivalent band, Wiltshire, Cornwall, etc. So it's helped us to avoid a Section 114 notice. It's part of exceptional financial support along with capitalisation direction. It's not. I think the gag has been told enough times that with 31 councils applying for exceptional financial support, it's no longer exceptional. There's no money involved, so it's not financial, and it's not a long-term support because there's no solution to local government finance. So exceptional financial support is of course welcome because we want to be able to manage our own affairs, but at the same time it's incredibly difficult because ultimately our residents are having to pay more, and at a time when they're seeing less services because the services go to those people most in need of adults and children's social care.
Councillor Marland.
I would just say on council tax banding, you could have council tax banding from A to Z in some places and they wouldn't raise a single extra penny because Manchester, if it puts council tax up by 1%, gets around about £1 million for every percentage that they put up council tax by. Milton Keynes draws in £1.8 million because we've already got quite a healthy band H, band G. Manchester won't have any more band Gs just because you expand the band down there. So Hyndburn is another good example of you run the risk of making more affluent places more affluent in terms of council tax intake. So although it would be welcomed in some places, and I think the ability for some places to raise council tax probably more than 2% on certain bands and have maybe the ability to have differential rates is probably helpful. But just coming back to the point that council tax ultimately is inherently unfair and is not the solution to the growing SEND problem. It's not the solution to pressures on adult social care, and it's not the solution to pressures on children's services. So it would go some way, but it would not help places like Nottingham, it wouldn't help places like Manchester, it wouldn't help places like Burnley because they're not building any Band-G homes and they don't have any more Band-G homes.
Just want to bring in Councillor Lewis and I'll come to Councillor Newmark and then Jeremy.
I just wanted to come back to your point, Bill, and ask a different kind of question. So you're saying that you applied to go above the council tax threshold by 2.5%, which was accepted. and we've done a lot of work on this committee around unitarisation, and your council went unitary, and we were always told, well, if you go unitary, you save loads of money, billions of pounds, there's local government's going to be awash with money. So how comes you're still struggling financially, even though you've gone through that unitary process?
Yeah, first of all, we're in the early days of going through that unitary process, so we are still finding savings. The business case that was approved by the previous government was for £18.6 million of savings. We reckon we've doubled that, in fact. The simple fact is the cost pressures in social care, the cost pressures in children's are rising at a rate faster than our ability to be able to make those savings from going unitary. I describe it as like trying to sprint up the down escalator and you still end up going backwards. We are making those savings, we are making those economies, but we can't do it fast enough to meet the demand.
Councillor Barry Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to make a point going back slightly to the council tax issue. Because of historic underfunding in the county council network, we have an over-reliance really on the council tax rises to fund services. So for us, it means our average bandy council tax rise in counties is 15% higher than the national average anyway. So I just wanted to make that point. And if you compare it to some of the London boroughs, etc., where you would expect that council tax costs would be higher, it's disproportionately not the case as well. So just to make that point. But coming back to this more up-to-date point around local government reform, the cost savings potentially inherent within the system, if we get the scale right, and scale is is critical to this, is quite significant. And I know you all know that the County Council Network did some research around this relatively recently. But if we creating 29 new unitary councils based on a minimum population of 500,000 would save the system £1.8 billion over a 5-year period, and then realising annual savings of around 5 million thereafter as well. So there is, I think, some strong evidence in there that is the one of the ways in which we can save the system some money and start thinking about how we reinvest some of that money back into the services that we all as councils want to be able to provide our residents.
I know the committee has previously looked at the Scottish model of gearing sort of higher tax increases on the higher bands, E or F through to H, and I do think that is a point that sort of addresses sort of Councillor Marland's concerns, but also might go some way towards alleviating the problem. And I think that's a debate that needs a bit more airspace. At district council level, I think people often don't realise that only 14% on average of district council funding actually comes from that central grant, even though we collect 100% of the council tax bill, and that's far less than the situation. Most other types of authority, on average, are keeping over 50% of that, and less than 10% of the average council tax bill goes to district councils sort of full stop. In fact, our share, or the district share, is now actually lower than the entire Police and Crime Commissioner precept in 90% of places. We have for some time now been advocating an increase in the limit from 5% or £10. We believe that would contribute an additional 100 million or so to district budgets on an annual basis, or 300 million over 3 years, and it would only mean an average increase of 69 pence to the Band D bill over 3 years. That's the kind of intervention that could make a real difference. And just on the unitarisation point, apologies to disagree slightly with Councillor Lewis, but there are all sorts of arguments that do make the case for unitarisation, but actually I think we have yet to see any compelling evidence that shows there is an absolute direct correlation between the size of a unitary council and its financial sustainability, and I think that's the long-term issue that needs to be addressed and looked into further.
Right. Thank you. Moving on to financial distress.
Lovely, thank you, Chair. Councillor Marland, to you first of all with your LGA hat on, if I may. Councillor Lewis remarked on how many councils might be at threat of a 114 if the high needs block isn't addressed. If we park that particular issue, how many councils do you think are in 114 territory within the next couple of years?
So I think the number of councils that applied for and were granted EFS doubled this year. I think it was in the 30s this year, wasn't it?
I think.
Yeah, it was. I think that gives a very solid indication that the narrowness and shortness of the runway in terms of what local councils have got left is pretty stark, really. And I would say that I've said for quite a while, I suspect within the next 2 to 3 years, if something serious doesn't happen, I would imagine I think the LGA say it's about upwards of 80% of councils are in at least some danger of issuing a 114 notice. But I would just again come back to some of the technicalities. We like to say 114. 114 is just a statutory notice to say you've got to pass a balanced budget within 28 days, is it, or 14 days. You know, I think the committee's looking at the financial sustainability of councils. Just because you issue a 114, you don't become automatically financial sustainable. So it's a massive challenge.
And that leads me nicely actually on to my second question, which can be for the whole panel, which is the Section 114 process. How successful do you think that's been in supporting councils out of financial distress?
That's in Newmark.
Look, it certainly is likely to result in short-term relief, but at the end of the day, it utterly fails to address the underlying issue of insufficient funding for local government. And of course, what people often lose sight of in this debate is that those costs sort of from the sort of EFS process are ultimately borne by local taxpayers. And if we really want to stem the tide here, the debate needs to shift to one around medium to long-term financial certainty, dealing with increase in demand, especially on the issue I referred to earlier around homelessness and the wider cost pressures. So, you know, we have an early warning system, we have short-term relief that adds to the cost of borrowing, by the way, and ultimately is paid for by taxpayers, but in the long term, not convinced.
Yeah, having spoken to leaders of councils who have in the Section 114 process, and when we were at the start of realising that our finances weren't sustainable, we had conversations about what does that actually mean, and we would, you know, when we started to understand double-digit council tax rises, pretty much compulsory selling off of assets regardless of community value, when we see services being cut to the absolute bone, particularly preventative services that we know are a long-term investment and will cost the council more in the future, we took the decision to try and take as many of those painful decisions as we could to retain local control, and also, you know, commissioners don't come cheap. And they decide when they leave, which is a great way to make a living. If you hired a tradesman into your house who could write his own invoice and decide when his finishing date was, I think you might think twice about bringing them in, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen over £1,000 a day on the day rate. I think Councillor Lewis has got his hand up. Yeah.
Councillor Lewis.
Yeah, thank you. There's a few aspects to this. I mean, we found ourselves as a county council in Derbyshire in some quite significant financial concern a couple of years ago with an in-year £46 million deficit that more or less it felt like it appeared kind of overnight, and it kind of did in a way. So we've managed our way through without exceptional financial support, without having to raise council tax above the threshold, but it has required an extraordinary sort of effort on the part of the council in order to achieve savings, and we've had to be fairly ruthless in how we do that, and in asset sales and things like that, to find ourselves in a position where we do actually have an improved general reserve position. But it's only saving off the inevitable if things don't change, and that's the key thing that we need to address. And I think some of the helpful things that might address that are things like the long-term sort of financial settlement, and understanding what we have coming down the line in coming years will be really helpful in terms of financial planning, and the work that's being done as well around the fair funding review and ensuring that we get that right as well.
Well, I would say it's probably been a bit of a mixed picture in terms of councils that have been issued or had issued Section 114 notices. Some, it was absolutely the right thing to do, and those councils had effectively not been governed very well, and I think the very first councils that ended up issuing 114 notices, it was very clear that it was just a breakdown of governance, breakdown of culture, breakdown of all sorts of things that mean the councils don't make very good decisions. I think sort of as we go on, it's become clearer and clearer that it's probably not the right bit of legislation for today. It was obviously passed in the early 1980s, effectively to stop Liverpool setting illegal budgets. So that is just a fact. You know, it was directed at one individual in one place to stop councillors voting to set deficit budgets. And so I would say, if looking at the sort of general view of does it make councils more sustainable, in some places where there is a good relationship between the commissioners and the council and the councillors, it has done very well. In some places it's more mixed, and in some places actually it has been actually more difficult, because they've made councils sell off assets that actually in the long term could have benefited those councils. So I think it is very much on a case-by-case basis, and I don't think the particular legislation is probably fit for today's purposes of making councils more financially sustainable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I come on to sort of early warning signs of financial distress? So, Pete, what sort of the sources of information available for that? And I highlight my council, Woking Borough Council, had several peer reviews before it declared Section 114. Despite the facts in negative equity by £1 billion, there were no concerns raised at the level of affordability. So do we think the peer reviews are working? I think in my experience, they haven't been, and councils have had to go under as a result.
So the OGA have recognised that as part of the local government assurance models, peer reviews weren't particularly strong. So I think when Northamptonshire existed, it had a peer review published one week that said, you know, everything is fine, nothing to look at here. The next week, everything was not fine, and so I think there are those cases over and over and over again, and it's a good example of actually sort of your own council. I think the LGA have moved to more of a peer challenge model that is a bit more robust, that is identifying those early warning signs, but ultimately the LGA is obviously a membership organisation. It needs to balance that. It needs to balance sector-led improvement with a sort of, we are not regulators. Literally, as I speak, there are peer challenge members in Milton Keynes City Council. It's our peer challenge week. When I've done them, I would be very, very clear where there are problems. I would identify them. Some of the processes a bit. It depends on the chief executive that you get, and depends on the lead peer that you get. But peer challenges are sector-led improvement. They should flag up any issues that come about through LG Inform and things like that. But ultimately, the LGA is not the stick by which to be able to intervene. But I think it can be the early signals of intervention, because there are a whole list of things. You know, poor governance, bad relationship between the chief executive and monitoring officer. You know, leaders being able to just do what they want. All of those sorts of things. If you're a good councillor and you go in and you recognise them straight away, you should be able to flag them. But again, where you flag them to is a very, very good question.
And then, Bill, from Somerset's point of view, what were the early warning signs you and your council had before you saw EFS?
So, on becoming unitary, we asked for a deep dive into the adult social care budget to understand why that budget had been overspending over a number of years, and to understand the forecasting of it that revealed that there hadn't been a rebasing of that budget for 13 years of the previous administration, and that we needed to, and that was the 100 million, the large part of the £100 million gap that we would see in our forecast budget for the next year, and that's where we started to have the conversations with MHCLG to say we're going to need some assistance here to get through this.
So I've heard that Section 114s are probably going to be given out like confetti, that upwards 80% of councils are probably in Section 114 territory. What other things do you think could be introduced to improve that early warning signs support for local authorities?
We could do more to address the audit backlog. I think that's a fairly obvious red flag and has a fairly critical role to play in this sort of ecosystem, if you like, of early warnings, and perhaps one that you might not be expecting to hear. But I think that this committee itself actually acts as quite an important early warning system. After all, your predecessors have been telling the government for some years about the likely impact of cuts to funding. You've issued calls for greater financial flexibilities, issued the regular reports, but certainly previous governments don't seem to have listened and taken that on board. So I think I would not underestimate the role that you play collectively as part of our early warning ecosystem.
We'll move on our last session.
Barry,
sorry, Barry, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Just on that point, I mean, I think that's quite right around the early warning system. The County Council Network, the LGA, local authorities across the country have been flagging that this is an issue that's going to be happening to local authorities if we don't address it in a timely fashion. But it's never quite happened. So I think that's the point I would really like to make as strong as possible. The early warnings were there; they've been apparent for some time. They have been raising red flags all the way up to kind of pretty big klaxon calls that this is a problem for the sector, but it hasn't necessarily been listened to.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. We've heard in a lot of our evidence that radical solutions are needed to resolve funding issues in the long term for local authorities. Can any of you think of any radical solutions that you think might work?
Not more money.
No. I actually think that is a really good question, and one that gets to the heart of the problem, which is there is an £8 billion gap in local government funding just to stand still. That is not to sort of do all the other things that councils need to do, or reset to a 2010 position as if 2010 was like the panacea of everything. But if we're going to lift children out of poverty, if we're going to make sure that all of these things are done, £8 billion just covers off a bill, so to speak. So it is actually, from my point of view, I think we're a well-run council. I'm not sure any leader sits here and goes, no, we're a really badly run council, please don't give us any more money. But if you gave that £8 billion, you're just filling in a hole from a system that isn't working. So what I would very clearly push back is extra funding, and I think you raised devolution earlier, extra funding does need to come with that reform agenda as well as what is wrong with SEND, how are we going to talk to parents and children to make sure that we've got a proper system in place, really, because actually the LGA did a study last year that was run by our now chair Louise Gittins. We are an outlier in the OECD and in the G7 about how many EHCPs we produce. So either we can choose to believe that in this country more of our children have SEND needs, or there's something wrong in the system and how we communicate with that. Same with adult social care. A lot of our conversation is about older people in hospital, and actually a lot of our spend is adults who come through a children's system, etc., etc. So I would push back quite hard on. Of course, I'm going to ask for money. We're local councillors. We could always do with more money, but actually in doing things like why is the DWP always delivering programmes around jobs when actually local councils can do them much better? Why is it that, you know, the police and crime commissioners and local councils should be working better together in delivering, reducing in crime and all of these sorts of things? There is a huge reform agenda, and I don't think we're necessarily, just by asking for more money, always sort of approaching that in the right way, because from the LJ perspective and no doubt other perspectives, we are in a very difficult financial position as a country, aren't we? Just asking for £8 billion is not going to happen for local government, is it? Let's be honest. But actually, can we secure more money with the promise of reform? And I think that's the road we absolutely have to go down.
Perhaps on the basis that one person's radical solution is another person's strategic intervention. There are considered measures that you see in place around Europe that certainly at district council level could make a huge difference. I'm thinking very specifically of things like introduction of local tourist levies. Many of our member areas are very popular tourist destinations, you know, the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, Cotswolds, Devon, even areas like my own in Hertsmere, sort of steeped in the history of the film and TV sector. Introduction of something like a tourist levy could help support those additional services that are inevitably required when you have a large tourist footfall, litter, waste collection, greater day-to-day management of green spaces and so on. I don't think that's particularly radical, but it's the kind of strategic intervention that ought to be able to make a significant difference without too much effort involved in implementation.
So Barry Lewis and then Joe quickly.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Chair. I mean, I'll go back to that point around fair funding and getting that right. Multi-year settlements, again, important. We had, over the course of the last decade or so, discussions about how we deliver adult social care through the Dilnot Review and so on. And more recent reviews have sought to we haven't got a recent review. That's the problem. It's been kicked down the road a little bit, and we need to perhaps do a bit more work around that. We've got a lot of issues, I think, within the social care system that we need to fix, and looking at how we can do that as well. Long-term investment into the system, making sure that local authorities have got the right funding to deal with the challenges that faces. I think it's important. Are we going to look at a public-private insurance model to help cover some of the care costs moving forward? That should be given some consideration. So honestly, I don't know how we're going to address that particular issue if we don't. Workforce reform and better pay and conditions within our social care workforce, I think, is going to be vitally important in how we deliver care, particularly in our communities where it's cheaper in the future. And I've already made the point around children's care as well, around addressing that issue around high-cost placements. The quicker we can get to solving that particular problem, that will save the system some considerable sums of money over the course of the next few years if we can get it done quickly.
Yeah, thank you.
Obviously, I don't want to preempt what the Prime Minister or the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions might say in the next couple of weeks, but I would sort of point to COVID-19 and the test and trace system, that an inordinate amount of public money was spent on a national test and trace system that just didn't work. And then somebody had this wonderful idea that maybe local councils could be able to deliver it, and we did it better and we did it cheaper. And there is one main determinant of whether people live longer, healthier lives, and that is their income, and that is the level of employment that they have and a good secure job, and that leads to a good secure home and things. And I think the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions is hopefully going to go down this line, is national changes to the benefits and welfare system won't work if they are just nationally driven, nationally sort of set sort of programs that sort of impinge. Actually, if you want to deliver better outcomes for Hyndburn, it should be focused on Hyndburn and Accrington, and places like that. So that's the sort of I think this government has been better at those conversations, but I think that it's that level of reform that we really need to be talking about.
Joe.
I mean, just briefly on funding, Councillor Newmark mentioned one idea on the tourist levy. I just wanted to see if there was any other of the panellists who wanted to come in on revenue raisers, be they different types of local taxes. We've had evidence in this committee around a land value tax, for example, or other ways of assigning national taxes locally. Does anyone else want to come in on that revenue side?
Yes, certainly we had a broader base of tax raising powers that would help. I'm not sure on the tourist tax whether we can apply that to tents at Glastonbury Festival, which is where I'd particularly be interested in exploring
the posh ones.
Maybe we'll have a banding system. I don't know, but certainly, yes, certainly any system whereby we can bring in extra revenue and get some cost recovery. I can't remember what we charge Glastonbury in their licensing fees, but it doesn't anywhere like cover the cost.
Just apologies, we are at time. Just to thank our witnesses for coming before us this morning. I think a lot of areas you've given us thoughts for discussions, and this, like I said, this is an issue that will continue to be on our radar. Thank you. Just going to do a switch over to the next panel quickly. Introduce themselves for Hansard, please.
Good morning, my name's Tony Dyer and I'm leader of Bristol City Council.
Hi, I'm Councillor Neghat, leader of Nottingham City Council.
Hi, I'm Councillor Grace Williams. I'm the Deputy Chair for London Councils and lead for housing for London Councils.
Thank you for attending the committee this morning. I'm sure you heard some of the discussions earlier. So one of the areas that we've been looking at, obviously, are cost pressures between city and urban areas. Would you say that the cost pressures you face are different to colleagues in other areas?
Yes.
In what way?
Because we're cities, we get more, if we think about temporary accommodation, people are more placed in the cities because of the transport links and the connectivities. So we see a lot more in, obviously, adult social care and the general kind of pressures that we've heard about earlier today, children's, adults, but temporary accommodation, I think cities see a lot more pressure on them.
Yeah, I would second that. I think if you look at where areas of deprivation are, there are areas of deprivation in most councils, but they are particularly concentrated in the larger urban cities. If I look at Bristol, for instance, when you look at the indices of multiple deprivation, Bristol has some 260 areas, and of those 40 are in the most deprived 10%. And within those are 3, including the area I grew up in, that are in the worst 1% in the entire country. And that's in a city like Bristol, which is normally perceived, or often perceived, as being one of the wealthier cities. Yeah. Other cities, amongst the core cities, have even worse situations.
Councillor Williams.
Yes, I mean, I would concord with that. So firstly, I'd say that, and I think you heard in the first session, that we face a lot of common pressures. So social care, SEND were talked about, but cities, and in particular London, are at the heart of the housing crisis. So more than half of homeless households nationally are London families, 56%. And I think we talked about this before in our previous session, but London boroughs are spending £4 million a day on temporary accommodation. So that equates to a unique pressure. And the extent to which homelessness pressures are the fastest growing risk to boroughs' finances is the thing that I would underline. And I think it would be, if I can, just to quickly show you what that looks like. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to bring in props, but this shows you what we call the chart of doom. This shows homelessness spending in London over the period, and there's no sense of it stopping. So actually we've seen a further rise. So I would underline the temporary accommodation pressure, and I'd also underline Neghat's point that the deprivation in cities is the other crucial thing that differs. And if you look at those local authorities that are having financial issues and seeking EFS, they tend to have high deprivation rates overall. So that's the other thing I'd underline.
Just on that, so again, we have heard a lot around temporary accommodation, and I think it's fair to say, yes, London bears the brunt, but it was also something that we picked up in our inquiry, that this is an issue that affects quite a lot of areas. What approaches have each of your councils been taking to mitigate the increase in demand? Because again, I think it's fair to say you're still seeing those demands increase over the last few years, even though you're seeing more government support. Councillor Dyer.
In particular, in terms of temporary accommodation, I mean, the underlying cause of the need for temporary accommodation is homelessness, and the reason why we have homelessness is because we have a housing crisis. And I think that everybody recognises that we have a housing crisis, but within that we also have an affordable housing crisis. In Bristol, if I give you an example, for 2-bed homes, only 1% of residents within Bristol can afford to buy a 2-bed home in Bristol because of the rise in costs. So in terms of some of the things we've been doing to address that, in temporary accommodation, our biggest cost is subsidy loss, and that's further augmented by the fact that we have been reliant on putting people into hotels, which have been very expensive. So what we've been trying to do is to work with our partners in Bristol to bring more units online that we can use for temporary accommodation. And in some cases that's meant we've had to prioritise people in temporary accommodation over our general population on our waiting list, and our waiting list is 21,000 households on the general waiting list, so that gives you a size of the problem. But we have 1,600 families or households in temporary accommodation. What we're also doing is, because we are one of the councils that still have a housing revenue account, obviously we are facing severe pressures in terms of bringing all our houses up to standard under the new regulation. So we have now started to use our general fund to acquire temporary accommodation. So we're acquiring 75 homes so that we can address that problem from the general fund. And then at some point in the future, once the HRA is back up to where we need it, we'll probably transfer those homes into the HRA account.
Sort of stress-free thing, so in terms of what we're doing about the pressures. So one is that boroughs' forecast overspend on homelessness budgets is 270 million, which is more than the homelessness prevention grant itself. And one of the ways that boroughs are dealing with pressures in homelessness is to look at cutting their real-term spending in HRAs. I mean, the housing revenue accounts, they're looking at cutting it by 260 million. And that's really difficult to do, because I think, as we've heard from Tony, doing that at the same time that we're having a higher burdens in terms of regulation, which is really important that we do, and we want to build homes. So cuts are happening there. The second thing I'd outline is that an increasing number of London boroughs are seeking exceptional financial support. And as you've heard, I think already, that's not a long-term solution, but we now have just under a quarter of boroughs are seeking that EFS, and that's a third of local authorities nationally that are seeking it. So that kind of short-term fix is being sought. And then the last thing I think I'd outline, I think you heard it a little bit in the first session, is that boroughs are constantly thinking of what we can do to reform and encourage more effective early intervention and prevention. So London, for example, is an area where from 2010 to 2023 we have been able to manage a reduction in children who are in care in a safe way, because we have focused on building those preventative services. And another example is the growth of prevention services in homelessness. So we've heard that we've got many families in temporary accommodation, London boroughs are working really hard at how can we prevent that, how can we help families to maximise their incomes and sustain their tenancies. I think the problem that we're seeing is that with the homelessness prevention grant, with the ring fence that was mentioned earlier, the ring fence to spend on TA costs is 49%, and at the moment boroughs are spending 80% of that money still on temporary accommodation costs. So those are the three things I'd highlight about what we're doing.
Just a quick follow-up, so just on because the previous two, you both mentioned the housing revenue account. Can you quantify the impact of the pressure on housing revenue accounts on the ability to build new homes, and what would allow councils to get building homes faster again?
I just come in and I would probably say the right to buy, that with council local authorities are able to keep 100% of that now. So in Nottingham there was many years that we weren't able to build, but because of that decision, and with the new government coming back in, we had to pay back 10.5 million to the previous government, a right to buy. Otherwise they were saying they were going to charge us interest of £1 million. So we gave the 10.5 million back, and then when the new government came in, we wrote to them and they gave us that, and that's actually helping us to build again and actually help our bottom line in temporary accommodation. I think I was just going to say in Nottingham what we're doing is bulk purchasing beds for the nights. So rather than doing it on a case by case, it's more expensive, but if we're buying ahead, it actually saves us money. And I think one of the other issues is though boroughs and districts are actually placing people in the city as well, and that's a problem. But their kind of thing is about connectivity, so that's an additional strain on councils. But in Nottingham, for example, no different from other places, we've got 11,000 people on a waiting list. We're the 11th most deprived out of 317 local authorities. If you think about child poverty, it's 40%, and when you look at these waiting lists or people in temporary accommodation, a lot of them are children, and it's not the way it should be.
No, that's good. Just lastly from me, obviously the government announced additional funding of around 500 million for local authorities to mitigate the impact of increase in employer national insurance contributions. Is that funding enough?
No.
No. I mean, our national insurance contributions, I think the coverage for the national insurance contributions probably covered about 60% of our costs, so we still had an additional 3 million that we need to find from other areas. And I think also the knock-on effect is that we commission a lot of services, particularly in adult social care, from third parties. They also are facing national insurance contributions, so that puts pressure on the cost of the care packages. So it's not just how it affects the council itself, it's how it affects our partners as well.
Gap in Nottingham was 900k, but a council in intervention, 900k is quite a lot.
Yeah, and similar picture. So for London boroughs, we expect the direct cost of the increase to be 116 million, but we'll only receive 89 million. And then, of course, we've heard the additional issue around primarily social care commissioning, and we think that the cost for London boroughs of direct and NIC increases for those contractors is likely to be 150 to 200 million pounds. So that issue of how do we look at our current contracts is going to be important, but the increase has to fall somewhere.
Okay. We'll take that back to colleagues. Will?
Thank you, Chairman. We're talking a lot about potentially reforming council tax, because I don't think anyone think this is the sensible way to fund local government. Obviously, the question is what replaces it. Do you think there should be a link between the amount of council tax that council charges and the services the council provides? If councils had fiscal powers to set their own rates of council tax or other forms of tax, that if they had more flexibility, do you think that would improve engagement, turnout in the elections?
I think if I look at Bristol's situation, council tax has gone up by the maximum amount allowed, both this year, the previous year, the year before that, so it's 5 years in a row. And I think one of the problems with with that is, you see, we have a lot of residents who are paying their council tax, but because of the pressures elsewhere, a lot of that council tax is being spent on very specialised services. So what they're seeing is a general decline in what they see on a day-to-day basis in street cleansing, parts and so on. And I think in places like Bristol, and I suspect it's similar to most of the other core cities, the vast majority of our properties are in Band A or Band B. So if we are going to start looking at council tax, the first thing that has to happen straight away is revaluation of the various bands. And I think, because we're in a ridiculous situation, I think I read somewhere that Buckingham Palace is actually pays less council tax than a Band C home in Oldham, which by any measurement is a ridiculous state of affairs. And I think what I would say, the one thing that probably needs reforming more than other is most local authorities, there are people who are simply unable to pay their council tax, and we need to support those people, but that's now being done essentially out of local authority budgets. So in Bristol we have a council tax reduction scheme which is costing us £43 million a year, with no support from the government to help provide that.
I'd probably say you'd get more people to come out and vote, because they'll tell you they don't want that to happen, and you'd keep seeing local government parties in charge change. But I think if we look at Nottingham, 80% are Band A and B, so every 1% we put up, we get 1.5 million. If you compare that to a place like Surrey, they put it up 1% and get 11 million. So at the moment, we clearly know that the council tax doesn't work, especially in poorer places.
I think it's a really good question, but I think maybe the first question is, what are local authorities there to do? What do our residents expect us to provide? And you've heard already about the fact that those big services, adults and children, social care and housing, are pushing up costs. So, for example, in Waltham Forest, about 60% of our council tax goes on those free services. So I'd probably start, and I think government really helpfully start with that broader agenda about local government finance reform. I think that's really important, because we've heard how regressive council tax is, and the fact that it hasn't been revalued for 30 years is a massive problem, and we've heard that. I mean, just particularly on London boroughs, I think sometimes London boroughs have had perceived to have had low tax levels due to historical decisions, but in the main we have a higher than average England average if you look at Band D, which is the guide. But I think actually if you look at the average that London residents are paying, it's actually far closer to the average. But I think that you've heard that geographically and from a fairness point of view, it's overdue a look in terms of reform. And I think that crucial point that residents should be able to look at what we're spending locally and feel like they're getting a good deal for their money. So I think how you look at council tax in that wider government's finance and devolution piece, and how you look at how we increase our powers, our fiscal powers, would really help to get a fairer system.
Two follow-up questions, if I may. Everyone said, we think, you all three of you said council tax should be revalued, but you did highlight, particularly from Nottingham's case, actually it's not a panacea because of the housing mix. So I suppose what is the extra thing that could be the panacea? You've talked about people not feeling the benefit of their council tax because of the strategic services. So if homelessness, adult social care was nationalised or properly funded, you would feel that would be the solution to empower people so they can relate to their council tax and the services they get. Is that correct?
Yes. So in Nottingham, 75.9% of our net spend is on children and adults. So I think if that happened, that would actually fix the broken system. But I also think that it's exploitation from the private sector, because we're paying up to £1 million for a young person to be cared for, and it's an unregulated market so the demand is obviously outstripping the kind of supply, so they can charge whatever. And I just think there needs to, nationally something needs to be done about that, when people can't exploit councils.
I think the thing I'll add to that is, I think having some control over elements of council tax locally would be a positive, but you're absolutely right, it's not a panacea. I think council tax in general probably isn't a solution to how you raise funds locally. But if we are staying with council tax, and in the earlier conversation you were asking about radical ideas, so one radical idea would be, the government has a housing target of 1.5 million homes. In Bristol, we currently have 16,000 homes with planning permission. About 3,000 of those are under construction, another 3,000 or so are in the early stages. Beyond that, we got probably 9,000 to 10,000 homes with planning permission that are simply not being delivered. What we would like to do is, once they get to the end of their 3-year planning permission, is to be allowed to charge them council tax. In Bristol, even if it was just Band B council tax, that would bring us in £17 to £20 million a year, which we can then invest in those wider services.
Radical. Lewis, you wanted to come in quickly?
Yes. Just a point first. When you're giving the committee examples, it is useful for us if they're like-for-like examples and not examples that we know would be different anyway because of the amount of people paying council tax or what have you. But just on council tax specifically, do you agree with the referendum cap? And if there was no cap, I get you can't sit here and say, well, we would raise it by X, but is it likely that you would raise it more than what the cap currently allows?
I'm actually against raising council tax more than 5% because you're putting more burden on local people who are already having to pick up a lot of these costs, if I'm honest, because what are they actually, we've kind of touched on that point, what they're actually getting for that tax. So I don't think it actually works because of you're putting more burden on local people who can't afford it, and then they're not paying their, for example, if they're not paying the council tax, then you're putting more pressure on them, and then they come around the system again because there'll be a family that could probably lose their home, for example, and become homeless, get into temporary accommodation, then mental health problems. There's a lot of issues and a lot of people are feeling pressure.
I mean, I think I would just add that I think the focus on local government funding reform needs to sort of sit across council tax. So rather than sort of fixating on council tax referendum limits, and we've seen that, haven't we, in some of those councils that are now seeking exceptional financial support, them raising council tax is seen as a crisis measure, short-term measure, and it is not popular. What we need to look at is systematic reform to government finance. So it's really good to see the government consulting on things like how can we restore the relationship between levels of deprivation and levels of funding, and fundamentally looking at things like how do we make sure we account for homelessness pressures, how do we make sure we have a fair area cost adjustment, how do we make sure that the formula emphasises that push towards prevention and early intervention. So I think we do need to be radical and we do need to be systematic rather than just focusing on short-term fixes around council tax levels. And I think the other thing is, those radical ideas about what would we do if councils had additional fiscal powers? How can we better align our economic incentives with local tax staying local, for example? How do we make sure that our local fiscal powers could encourage growth? So I think looking at that big picture, focusing on the long-term fixes is what's needed if we're going to be in any kind of position of more councils not going into EFS.
And just specifically on that, you mentioned lots of things that would obviously get more money from central government to cities, but do you think rural councils should obviously be compensated? Because in some instances, in a rural authority, it costs more to collect the bins than what it would do in your authority, for example.
So that's a really excellent question, but I think you heard earlier on that we were all singing from the same hymn sheet. We may be facing a different combination of pressures in terms of adults, children, social care and homelessness, but actually the issues are surprisingly similar. So on the issues of how much it costs to collect your bins, completely right, it's going to cost more to drive further between houses in your bin contracts, but then urban areas have the problem that we have a much higher proportion of homes that are flats. And so our recycling rates are much lower and we have to work much harder on fly tipping and recycling. So I think it's really important that area cost adjustment is done in a nuanced and sophisticated way that recognises that we all have different pressures, but there has to be that fairness point. And I was really pleased to hear comments from colleagues earlier, actually.
I'd just come in response to that, because we actually consulted, because when we went out to consultation on our council tax, it was before the government made a decision about what a cap would be. So we actually consulted on everything from a 0% wise to a 10% wise on general council tax, and 0% to 5% wise on the social care precept. And we actually had a majority in favour of a rise above what we actually ended up with, which is the 4.99%. However, when you break that down by decile, income decile, those people at the bottom end, the poorest people, were the most opposed to any council tax rise at all. And I think that goes back to what Neghat was saying. I would be concerned about why is it increasing council tax, even though people are in favour of and willing to pay more, if I wasn't able to protect our lowest income households.
I think this is an area that will continue to rumble on, and maybe it's a shame that the government haven't put forward any proposals to update or reform council tax, which Minister McMahon did confirm will.
Just want to dive into Nottingham's issues, I'm afraid, and I say this as MP for Woking, so sort of you have my sympathy. What led, could you explain sort of briefly to the committee what led to Nottingham City Council issuing a 114 2 years ago? What were the consequences of it? And do you think it helped Nottingham regain financial stability? And then finally, sort of what lessons can we as a committee but other councils learn from your experience?
I'm still trying to work out how we got issued with a 114. I think it was, at the time, our Section 151 officer looking at the situation, and we had a gap of 17.6 million, which was 6.7% overspend, and he decided to issue a Section 114 because we were using reserves at the time. The concern that, and we weren't able to question that, but the concern is, if you look at the balance sheet, our reserves went from 8.9 million in that year actually to 22.7. So we issued a 114, but at the same time we put 13.8 million in reserves. And one of the concerns that were raised as well, and we're not really sure if any dialogue did take place with MLC, the government, to see actually what could have been done. I think afterwards there were some concerns raised that that's the way it should have been done. But I think once you issue a 114, then it kind of locks down the council spend, goes to the 151 officer, and it just kind of, people think your council's gone bankrupt, but if we were bankrupt, we wouldn't actually be sitting on more than 63 million today in reserves. So I think there are some concerns that we're going to deal with on that point. But even this year, we've set a balanced budget. We've put £1 million in reserves. We've not used any reserves. We have had exceptional financial support up to, we've got the ability to get 41 million. We're looking at using 35 million of that. I think we've put in for an additional 25 million next year. Don't think we're going to need it all, and hopefully by 27-28 we don't need exceptional financial support. But I think there's that kind of understanding of what actually is exceptional financial support. It's not a loan or anything from government. It's just you can sell your assets to pay for your revenue kind of costs, but it has a negative impact on our capital programme. So there's stuff that we've not been able to fund it because the first call on selling assets is on exceptional financial support. So we've kind of stood still, and it doesn't, in local government, it doesn't help with that. But I think the kind of distress sounds are when you're using more reserves, and I think you've got to look at it. But for us, where we are, we've got commissioners in Nottingham, but they're paying £1,000 a day for each one of them. But I don't see ourselves as a council in distress. But it is good to, probably won't get that a lot, but we've got really good commissioners who are really helping us, and I think it was the alarm bells that went, but we're actually on our way out there.
Can I talk about EFS and potential solutions? So EFS is the tool that the government has to help councils in finance, which is effectively a loan to buy councils time to sell assets, transform services that they can't do quickly. And it's so that we as councils can live within our means eventually after a period of transformation. So it buys you time But if time isn't the problem to cut services or save money, there does seem to be a problem. What are the panel's thoughts on that understanding?
I just come in really quickly. So I think that you're completely right. You could see that it buys time, but one of the things that we've seen recently, so with the EFS regime, is in London, where we've had 2 councils who've needed EFS for a couple of years now, is that as they go through that process of using using their viable surplus assets, selling them, capital receipts being exhausted, the amount of EFS they need is actually growing. And that's the real worry. That's with the 2 boroughs that have had it for a couple of years, and I wonder if that's an experience that Nottingham's had.
Just on that, Grace, are you effectively saying that ESF hasn't been effective?
So we've heard, I think, in both these sessions, and you've obviously experienced this in your borough, that the reasons for seeking EFS are quite varied. So I'm sure there are different experiences, but where we have in London 2 boroughs that have had EFS over those couple of years, it isn't helping, because over time they are having to pay more of that debt, and actually the situation's getting worse year on year for them.
Yeah, and I'd probably just add, it's not actually a loan. It's not like the government's actually giving you the money. They're telling you can sell assets, so you have to sell them. And if you don't sell them, then you're borrowing from the market to pay that back, and then there's interest on there. But when you sell an asset, it's gone. You only can sell it once, and it creates a revenue pressure. So in the early days, we sold things that weren't probably making as much money, but now we're in that territory where we're losing revenue.
Thank you. Chris and Joe, just last section.
Thank you. We talked a little bit about council tax and reforms that might have helped. Do you think there's any more taxation powers that should be devolved down to local councils that would have helped you avoid some of the challenges your councils have been facing?
I think if I take a wider view of this at the moment, I mean, and this is something that's come up in a number of reports, and Centre for Cities have particularly looked at, I think we need to compare what's happening in Bristol in the UK with our second layer cities like Birmingham, Nottingham, Manchester and so on. That should be driving the economy. And if you compare what's happened here in the UK and you look at Germany and France and other European countries, well, the second layer economies, cities are driving the economy. And I think the Centre for Cities identified that if local authorities and those second layer cities in England and Wales and Scotland were put in that same position, it will add £100 billion a year to the UK economy. And I think one of the things I've come across quite a bit is how much difference we have in our flexibility and our powers to make decisions that would put us on a similar level as other European cities. So sort of things to be happening. It's not so much about additional taxes, because I think additional taxes on the residents, they already feel they're paying enough in taxation, but it might be something for instance, by declaring a certain percentage of local income raised in a particularly local authority as being available to that local authority to decide how to spend. And the government could put mandates on what sort of outcomes they want from that spending, but within that allow the local authorities the flexibility to decide how to spend that. And then I think other areas I mentioned about being able to charge council tax on unbuilt properties, but also I think if you look at areas, I think a tourism tax was mentioned previously. I think we would like to look at what the Welsh Government in particular are doing, and some of the options available there. And I think a key element of it also is about enabling us to work with private partners as well locally in much more partnership way. And at the moment, there is a feeling that when the public sector and particularly local government work with private companies, that there's a feeling they're worried about being taken advantage of. And often that's because of a lack of expertise, because the local government sector in particular has been hollowed out in a lot of areas. What we think is, and in Bristol we've done some of this with things like City Leap and a couple of other investment areas mainly looking at net zero and similar sort of areas. So I think there is opportunities there, not just about local taxation, but also about enabling us to take advantage of private sector investment from within our own local authorities.
And just if I could add, if you look at the exceptional financial, the list of local authorities, 11 of the 42 are actually in the top 100 of most deprived areas as well. And I think, you know, if we could just fix the adults, children, homeless, it's easy to say, but if we could fix the system, fundamentally that would help all local authorities, whatever they may call.
And I think I would only add very quickly that if our abiding mission is growth, then how we can incentivise growth in local communities has to be the key, because otherwise we will be focused on how we divide up a smaller and smaller pie. And residents want to see local authorities have more control over how their councils deliver services, and the opportunity of devolution is for us to look at those fiscal powers, and it's something that perhaps hasn't had that much focus yet, you know, those fiscal powers in terms of how we retain our business rates, how we retain council tax. Talked a bit about a tourism tax, a new growth and skills levy. Those things are going to be what drives change. Otherwise, we are looking at recycling the same issues and not finding those long-term solutions.
Sorry, could I just give an example? So we've got in Nottingham the workplace parking levy. That actually brings in income, and we've spend that on our transport. That's why we've got the best transport outside of London. Get that in there.
That's also why Bristol wants to look at bringing in a workplace parking levy, because we have the worst transport outside of London.
Okay. Right, thank you so much for coming this morning, and apologies it was a bit curtailed in that second session, but I think again you've given us some ideas there. I think the key word that comes up is local government reform and finances, and I think again as we go on with this session, we'll be looking at areas where we can push government to be more radical. Order, order.